This is a case that was solved by one of the strangest, most chilling pieces of evidence I've ever come across. A small memory card found on the street with a handwritten label that read, in effect, homicide. A killer who was so brazen, so detached, that he filmed himself murdering a woman, saved it onto an SD card, and then lost that card in the most careless way imaginable. It led police directly to him, and to a second victim no one had even connected to a crime. And it exposed a painful larger truth about which victims get noticed and which get ignored. This is the murder of Kathleen Jo Henry, and the case of the SD card. Let me start with who Kathleen was, because she belongs at the center of this, not the man who killed her. Kathleen Jo Henry was 30 years old. She was an Alaska Native woman, indigenous, and she was, at the time, experiencing homelessness in Anchorage, Alaska. That detail matters enormously, and we'll come back to it, because it's part of why a predator believed he could get away with what he did. Kathleen was a daughter, a person with a family and a community, a woman whose life had value regardless of her circumstances, but she was also exactly the kind of victim that society too often overlooks: indigenous, unhoused, vulnerable, and a killer counted on that. In September of 2019, Kathleen was murdered in a hotel room in Anchorage, a Town Place Suites, a Marriott property, in a specific room that would later become infamous in the case. She was killed by a man named Brian Stephen Smith. And what made this murder so uniquely horrifying is that Smith didn't just kill Kathleen Henry. He documented it. He used his phone to record videos and take photographs as he assaulted and killed her, capturing her final, terrified moments and his own crime in graphic detail. He created a recorded trophy of the murder. It's the kind of cold, dehumanizing detachment that's almost impossible to comprehend. Not just taking a life, but filming it, keeping it, as if it were something to look back on. And here is where the case turns on a thread of pure chance. Brian Smith transferred or stored that footage onto a digital memory card, an SD card. And at some point afterward, a woman came into possession of a phone that had been taken from Smith's truck. On that phone, or with it, was the SD card. And when this woman looked at what was on it, she found the unthinkable: photos and videos of a woman being murdered. She also reportedly saw that the card had been labeled with the words "homicide at Midtown," a reference to the hotel. Imagine finding that. She did the right and brave thing. She took it to the police. By various accounts, the card contained something like a dozen videos and dozens of photographs documenting Kathleen Henry's assault and death. It was, in effect, a confession in moving images, the entire crime, recorded by the killer's own hand, now in the hands of the police. That footage led investigators straight to Brian Stephen Smith. In October of 2019, he was arrested. The video evidence didn't just suggest his guilt, it showed it, directly and undeniably. And the investigation also led them to recover Kathleen Henry's remains, a woman who might otherwise have been just another missing, unhoused Indigenous person. The kind of disappearance that, tragically, too often generates little urgency, now had her killer identified because of a memory card a stranger found and refused to ignore. But the case got even darker because Brian Smith wasn't a one-time killer. As investigators dug into him, they connected him to a second murder, the killing of another Alaska Native woman, Veronica Abouchuk, who was 52. Veronica had been reported missing earlier, and her death had not been solved. Smith was ultimately linked to her killing as well. So this was not an isolated act of violence. This was a man who had murdered at least 2 Indigenous Alaska Native women. And the second one only came to light because the first murder, captured on that SD card, brought Brian Smith into the spotlight. Without the card, it's entirely possible that neither case would have been solved, and that Smith might have continued. There's a detail about Brian Smith worth noting for the record. He was a South African national who had been living in the United States. In 2024, he stood trial, and the evidence, above all, his own recordings, was overwhelming. He was convicted on multiple counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of both Kathleen Henry and Veronica Abouchuk. And in July of 2024, Brian Stephen Smith was sentenced to 226 years in prison, effectively ensuring he will never be free again. For a case this brutal, it was about as complete a legal outcome as is possible. But I don't want to leave this as just a story about a shocking piece of evidence and a long sentence, because that would miss the most important part. This case shone a harsh light on a crisis that Indigenous communities in Alaska, Canada, and across North America have been crying out about for years: the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Native women are murdered and go missing at rates far higher than the general population, and their cases too often receive less attention, fewer resources, and less urgency from authorities and the media. Brian Smith targeted Kathleen Henry and Veronica Abouchuk precisely because they were vulnerable, Indigenous, marginalized, in Kathleen's case unhoused, and because on some level, he likely believed that women like them could disappear without anyone caring enough to come looking. He nearly got away with it. The only reason he didn't is a fluke. A memory card on the street, and a stranger who looked. Think about how fragile that is. The justice in this case didn't come from a system that prioritized 2 Indigenous women. It came from random chance. And that should make us deeply uncomfortable, because it means that the predators who target the marginalized are often right about their odds. How many killers don't film themselves? How many SD cards never get found? The Kathleen Henry case is a conviction and a 226-year sentence, yes. But it's also a warning, a glimpse of how many cases like it never get solved at all because the victims were the kind of people the world had already decided not to look too hard for. So let's do what too many failed to do for women like her: center her. Kathleen Jo Henry was a 30-year-old Alaska Native woman whose life mattered, whose final moments were stolen and degraded by a man who saw her as disposable. And Veronica Abouchuk, 52, another Indigenous woman, whose death might never have been answered for without that chance discovery. They were not disposable. They were not invisible. Their killer is in prison for the rest of his life. But the larger fight, to make sure that women like them are searched for, valued, and protected before it's too late, is far from over. Remember their names: Kathleen Henry, Veronica Abouchuk, and remember the stranger who found that card and refused to look away. Thank you for sitting with me here in the quiet dark. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one.